They tell us empires collapse slowly. Brick by brick. Year by year. From decadence, decay, or defeat stretched across generations. But that belief exists to comfort us, not to tell us the truth. Because sometimes, history does not unfold gradually. Sometimes it snaps. Sometimes an entire world, armies, cities, bloodlines, economies, hangs on a single decision made in silence, under pressure, by one human mind that misjudged reality by a fraction of a moment. This was one of those times. No thunder announced it. No prophecy warned of it. There were no flames in the sky or earthquakes beneath the feet of those involved. Just a room. A voice. A calculation. And a choice that felt reasonable, even necessary, in that instant. On the surface, nothing appeared to change. The banners still flew. The officials still bowed. The soldiers still obeyed. The empire still looked invincible. But the decision had already begun its work. What makes this moment unsettling is not the scale of destruction that followed, but how invisible the danger was at the time. The signs were present, yet misunderstood. The warnings existed, yet were dismissed. And the logic behind the choice was not madness or arrogance, but something far more familiar: fear of appearing weak, faith in precedent, and the quiet human tendency to believe tomorrow will resemble yesterday. The people who lived through that day did not believe they were witnessing the end of anything. They believed they were preserving order, maintaining stability, avoiding chaos. In their minds, the choice was not reckless. It was responsible. That is what makes it terrifying. Because empires rarely fall from external force alone. They fall when their internal logic stops matching reality. When old assumptions are applied to new conditions. When power becomes so accustomed to obedience that it forgets resistance can evolve. This decision did not come from ignorance. It came from experience. From tradition. From a system that had worked too many times before. And in that moment, experience became a liability. The decision-maker did not act in a vacuum. Advisors were present. Reports had been read. Numbers were known. Options were weighed. Yet something crucial was missing, not information, but interpretation. The world had shifted just enough that the same action now carried a radically different consequence. But recognizing that would have required admitting uncertainty. And uncertainty, in an empire, is often more dangerous than being wrong. So the choice was made. Orders were given with confidence. Messages were dispatched. The machinery of power moved exactly as it was designed to move. And still, beneath that flawless execution, the structure had already failed. Like a fracture running through stone, invisible until weight is applied. What followed was not immediate chaos, but something colder. A delay. A pause where nothing seemed to happen at all. This is the part history books often compress into a sentence. But it was during this silence that the outcome became irreversible. While leaders waited for confirmation, reality advanced without them. While they trusted in the inevitability of compliance, new forces calculated alternatives. The empire believed it was enforcing order. The world heard something else. By the time consequences became visible, the decision could no longer be undone. The mechanisms that might have corrected it were the very ones the decision had neutralized. Authority, once absolute, suddenly required persuasion. Loyalty, once assumed, now needed proof. And fear, once a reliable tool, began producing the opposite effect. The most haunting aspect is that this was not a dramatic gamble. It was not a bold experiment. It was routine. Almost boring. A choice made because it had been made before. Because it had always worked before. Because nothing, in living memory, suggested it wouldn't. That is how history traps the powerful. Not with chaos, but with familiarity. Long after the empire vanished, survivors would argue about causes. They would blame enemies, economics, betrayal, fate. But none of those explanations fully capture what happened. Because all of them came later. The collapse began earlier, in a quiet moment where maintaining control felt safer than adapting to change. And the empire paid for that instinct with its existence. What if the decision had gone the other way? What if hesitation had replaced certainty? What if caution had outweighed pride? These questions linger not because they promise redemption, but because they expose how thin the line truly was. A line measured not in armies or wealth, but in judgment. This is not a story about cruelty or incompetence. It is a story about logic pushed past its expiration date. About how systems reward consistency until consistency becomes fatal. About how the most dangerous mistakes are not the ones made in panic, but the ones made calmly, with full confidence, by people who believe they understand the world better than it understands itself. And once that decision was spoken aloud, the empire's fate no longer belonged to its rulers. It belonged to time. The world in which this decision was made was not fragile. It was vast, structured, and deeply confident in itself. An empire rose from water and stone, its capital engineered with mathematical precision, causeways stretching like controlled arteries across a great lake, temples aligned to cosmic cycles older than memory. Power here was not improvised. It was ritualized, bureaucratic, and reinforced daily by tribute flowing in from hundreds of subject cities. This was a civilization that measured time, human life, and divine favor with equal seriousness. At the center of it stood Moctezuma II, a ruler educated from childhood not merely to govern, but to interpret the universe. He was not a king in the European sense. He was a mediator between gods and men, a custodian of balance. His authority was immense, yet constrained by tradition, prophecy, and precedent. Every action carried symbolic weight. Every hesitation could echo across the empire as doubt. This empire dominated the Valley of Mexico in the early 16th century, binding rival city-states through intimidation, alliance, and obligation. Its military could mobilize tens of thousands of warriors within days. Its economy functioned through vast markets where cacao, obsidian, gold, and human captives changed hands under strict regulation. Information traveled quickly along roads maintained by runners trained from childhood to carry messages at speed. From the outside, it appeared unassailable. But stability can conceal vulnerability. Beyond the eastern horizon, across an ocean this empire did not know existed, another world had developed under very different assumptions. Its leaders believed conquest justified by faith, expansion driven by profit, and power proven through dominance over land and people. When a small expedition landed on the coast of what is now Mexico, it did not announce itself as an invading army. It presented as traders, diplomats, emissaries. Fewer than 600 men stepped onto the shore, carrying unfamiliar animals, strange weapons, and a confidence that bordered on recklessness. Their leader was Hernán Cortés, not a general backed by an empire's full strength, but an ambitious outsider operating on uncertain authority. He burned his own ships not as a grand gesture, but as a practical calculation. Retreat would fracture loyalty. Forward motion was his only option. He understood something critical from the beginning, that he did not need to defeat an empire militarily. He only needed to enter its political bloodstream. Word of these strangers traveled inland faster than the men themselves. Reports described weapons that thundered, animals taller than any deer, and men who fought without regard for ritual rules of warfare. More unsettling were the contradictions. The strangers bled when cut. They died when struck. Yet they advanced with a confidence that suggested divine protection or strategic desperation. Neither interpretation was comforting. Moctezuma faced a dilemma unlike any his predecessors had encountered. His advisors debated frantically. Some urged immediate force, destroy the strangers on the coast before they could gather allies. Others warned that violence against possible envoys of the gods could invite cosmic disaster. The empire's worldview did not separate politics from metaphysics. History, for them, unfolded within cycles. Certain years carried ominous significance. certain signs demanded caution. And this was one of those years. Instead of ordering an attack, Moctezuma chose observation. He sent gifts, gold, textiles, food, not as tribute, but as measured hospitality. The intention was clear: demonstrate wealth, establish superiority, and perhaps intimidate these visitors into leaving. It was a move grounded in tradition. In previous generations, lesser challengers had been overwhelmed psychologically long before battle. Displaying power had always worked. But gold does not intimidate men who came specifically to take it. As the Spaniards moved inland, they did not march alone. Long oppressed subject states joined them eagerly. These were not passive provinces. They were resentful, disciplined, and intimately familiar with Aztec military practices. Tens of thousands would eventually align with Cortés, not out of loyalty, but calculation. They saw in the strangers an opportunity to rebalance a system that had extracted blood and tribute for decades. Moctezuma knew this resentment existed. He ruled through it daily. But he believed it manageable, contained by fear and ritual obligation. What he underestimated was how quickly fear could change sides when an alternative appeared. When Cortés reached the edge of the capital, the decision still hung unresolved. The city was defensible. The causeways could be destroyed. The lake itself could become a weapon. The invaders could be isolated, starved, annihilated. Militarily, the options favored the empire. Psychologically, they did not. Moctezuma chose welcome. He ordered the gates opened. He invited Cortés into the heart of the empire. Not as a prisoner. Not as a conqueror. As a guest. To modern eyes, this appears incomprehensible. But within the logic of the time, it was cautious, even restrained. Killing emissaries could provoke unknown consequences. Housing them allowed surveillance. Hospitality signaled confidence. Control, Moctezuma believed, could be maintained through proximity. What this decision did, quietly and irreversibly, was collapse distance. Once inside the capital, the Spaniards saw everything. The scale of the city. The routines of governance. The ceremonial rhythms. The choke points. They learned where authority physically resided. They realized power here was centralized not just politically, but symbolically, in the person of the ruler himself. And they adapted instantly. The empire had prepared for siege, rebellion, famine, and war. It had not prepared for its own ruler to become the vulnerability. Moctezuma's decision was not made in ignorance. It was made from a belief that the old rules still applied. That hierarchy would be respected. That outsiders, once awed by grandeur, would submit or withdraw. That the appearance of control was control. History would prove otherwise. The moment the gates closed behind the Spaniards, the balance shifted. Not because the empire was weak, but because it had invited uncertainty into its center, believing tradition could contain it. From that point forward, every choice became reactive. Every delay compounded risk. And the logic that once preserved stability began producing paralysis. The empire still stood. Its armies still existed. Its people still obeyed. But something essential had already been surrendered. Inside the capital, the imbalance was immediate, measurable, and quietly terrifying. Fewer than 600 foreign soldiers now stood within a city of over 200,000 inhabitants. Around them lived tens of thousands of trained warriors, men raised from adolescence to fight, conditioned to pain, discipline, and coordinated movement. Armories existed within walking distance. The causeways leading out of the city could be cut in hours. Canoes could flood the lake with fighters by the thousands before dawn. By every numerical and logistical metric, the invaders were already defeated. And yet, nothing happened. The Spaniards were housed, fed, and escorted. They were allowed to walk the markets, observe rituals, study the flow of the city. They were watched, but not constrained. Their weapons were noted but not confiscated. Their horses, which terrified on first sight, were allowed space to move and breathe. Every concession was small, reasonable, temporary, and each one eroded a boundary that had once protected the empire. Fear did not come from the foreigners themselves. It came from uncertainty. No one knew which rules applied anymore. The old laws of warfare dictated immediate response or ritual containment. Diplomacy demanded restraint. Religion urged caution. And above all, the presence of the ruler's decision froze initiative. No general wanted to act independently. No priest wanted to advise bloodshed. No official wanted responsibility for provoking catastrophe. This paralysis spread faster than panic ever could. The Spaniards, by contrast, moved with clarity. They counted distances. They measured routines. They observed guard rotations and ceremonial schedules. They understood something the empire did not yet realize, that power here was concentrated, not dispersed. Control radiated outward from the ruler. If that center could be seized, the rest would fracture. Pressure mounted from every direction. Outside the capital, allied indigenous forces swelled into the tens of thousands. These were not chaotic mobs. They were disciplined fighters with their own command structures, intimately familiar with the terrain and the empire's military habits. Each day the Spaniards remained alive inside the city emboldened these allies. Each night without action signaled weakness. Within the capital, rumors multiplied. Markets whispered. Temples murmured. Some believed the newcomers were divine. Others believed the gods had abandoned the ruler. Most believed nothing at all, only that something had gone wrong. When certainty vanishes, people do not need proof to feel fear. They only need silence. The ruler attempted to maintain order through appearances. Public rituals continued. Ceremonies were performed with precision. He addressed the people calmly. But authority is not sustained by ritual alone. It requires credibility. And credibility depends on alignment between words and visible reality. The reality now included armed foreigners sleeping within palace walls. Then came the spark. A confrontation outside the city, minor by imperial standards, resulted in the deaths of several Spaniards. The cause was unclear. A skirmish. A misunderstanding. A challenge from a provincial group. In any other context, such losses would have triggered overwhelming retaliation. Here, they triggered something far more dangerous. Fear. The Spaniards reacted not with force outward, but with force inward. They moved quickly, decisively, and with complete disregard for local custom. They seized the ruler. There was no great battle. No siege. No heroic stand. They walked into the palace and took him hostage. In a single moment, the psychological hierarchy inverted. The ruler was not killed. That would have been understandable. He was not exiled. That would have been manageable. He was displayed, alive, compliant, speaking on behalf of men who now controlled his movements. The population watched their sacred intermediary issue orders under visible constraint. Tribute continued to be collected, not for the empire, but for its occupiers. This was the point of no return. Armies can be rebuilt. Cities can be retaken. But symbolic authority, once broken publicly, cannot be restored by force alone. Every command the ruler issued now carried ambiguity. Was it his will, or theirs? Every official hesitated. Every priest questioned omens that had already been violated. The Spaniards did not need to control the city physically. They controlled it psychologically. Still, the empire did not collapse immediately. Tension thickened instead. Resistance simmered beneath the surface. Warriors gathered quietly. The population's fear began to shift into anger, not at the foreigners alone, but at the leadership that had allowed this humiliation to occur. The same restraint that once seemed wise now looked like submission. Numbers that once favored stability now threatened explosion. Hundreds of thousands of civilians. Tens of thousands of warriors. Narrow causeways. Limited food reserves. A city built for ritual order, not prolonged internal occupation. And the Spaniards knew time was no longer on their side. An ill-timed massacre during a religious festival, executed by the occupiers in the ruler's absence, ignited the city. Drums sounded. Stones flew. The lake filled with canoes. The restraint that had frozen action shattered into fury. The population rose, not with coordination, but with raw momentum. What had been suppressed now surged. The ruler was brought forward to calm the crowd. It did not work. Whether struck by a stone from his own people or wounded under contested circumstances, the ruler fell. And with him fell the last thread holding the old order together. The people did not see a martyr. They saw a failure. A man who had allowed the unimaginable to occur and could no longer protect them from its consequences. The Spaniards fled under cover of night, burdened by stolen gold, hunted across causeways slick with rain and blood. Hundreds died. Many drowned. The lake swallowed men and metal alike. For a moment, it seemed the empire had purged the infection. But the damage was already irreversible. The ruler's capture had taught the enemy exactly how the system worked, and taught the people exactly how it could fail. Leadership was contested. Authority fragmented. Allies defected openly. The empire's greatest strength, centralized control, became its greatest liability once decapitated. What followed would not be decided by a single battle, but by exhaustion, disease, and the loss of legitimacy. The numbers that once guaranteed victory now strained food, order, and morale. And the invaders, having learned the empire's psychology, would return not as guests, but as architects of collapse. All of this traced back to one choice, to preserve control through proximity rather than force. A decision meant to prevent chaos that instead invited it inside the walls. And the most devastating consequence had not yet arrived. The hidden turn did not occur during battle. It did not emerge from bloodshed or betrayal. It unfolded quietly, through protocol, etiquette, and a belief so deeply ingrained it felt invisible to those who held it. This was not a failure of courage. It was a failure of conceptual imagination, a misreading of what power meant when confronted by a system that did not share the same rules. The empire's leadership believed authority was sacred, not negotiable. That the ruler's body was untouchable not because of guards or walls, but because the universe itself enforced the boundary. This belief had never been tested by outsiders who rejected its premise entirely. When the foreigners entered the capital, they did not see a sacred axis binding heaven and earth. They saw a command center. And the decision that sealed everything was not the welcome itself, but the assumption that physical proximity equaled control. By allowing the foreigners to remain close, unrestrained, and visible, the leadership believed they were neutralizing threat through observation. This was standard imperial logic. Potential rivals were absorbed, watched, ritualized, made small by scale and ceremony. Distance was dangerous. Proximity was dominance. It had worked for generations against neighboring states, rebellious nobles, and internal challengers. What was overlooked was that this logic only functioned when all participants accepted the same symbolic hierarchy. The foreigners did not. They operated under a different psychological framework, one in which authority could be seized, displayed, and repurposed. They did not need to destroy the system. They only needed to hijack its keystone. And that keystone was the ruler himself. The hidden mistake was assuming that restraint preserved legitimacy. In truth, restraint signaled uncertainty. When the foreigners were not disarmed, it communicated tolerance. When they were not confined, it suggested hesitation. When they were allowed to observe rituals, it revealed routines. Each act of patience, intended to demonstrate confidence, instead transmitted vulnerability to observers who measured strength differently. The capture of the ruler was not a bold gamble by the foreigners. It was an obvious move once the conditions existed. They did not invent the opportunity. It was presented to them, slowly, politely, and with ceremonial care. And here lies the deeper, often ignored detail: the ruler complied. Not because he was weak, but because the conceptual framework he inhabited did not permit open resistance in that moment. To fight back physically while alive within sacred space, surrounded by foreign uncertainty, risked cosmic disorder. He believed that by submitting temporarily, he could preserve long-term balance. That the gods would not abandon a ruler who upheld restraint. This was the fatal miscalculation. Power, once seen obeying at the point of a foreign weapon, ceases to be power. It becomes performance. And performance, when exposed, invites challenge. The empire's structure depended on the ruler being beyond coercion. The moment coercion became visible, the system lost its anchor. Officials did not know whether orders were legitimate. Priests did not know whether rituals still held meaning. Warriors did not know whether obedience now meant complicity. The foreigners exploited this ambiguity relentlessly. They did not announce conquest. They spoke in the ruler's name. They issued commands through his voice. They collected tribute under his gaze. This created a psychological fracture more devastating than any massacre. The people could not rebel cleanly, because rebellion would mean defying their own sacred authority. But they could not submit without shame. So they waited. And waiting corroded everything. What makes this decision so tragic is that alternatives existed. The foreigners could have been isolated immediately. Their weapons confiscated. Their movements restricted. Even hospitality could have been paired with containment. None of these options violated tradition. They were simply never combined before. The leadership chose the path that preserved appearances rather than adaptability. In doing so, they surrendered initiative. Initiative is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is the quiet ability to define the terms of engagement. Once lost, every subsequent action becomes reactive. And reaction, in a rapidly shifting crisis, is indistinguishable from surrender. The ruler believed time favored him. That the longer the foreigners remained inside the system, the more they would be absorbed by it. What he did not account for was asymmetry. The foreigners did not need time. They needed access. And they got it. When resistance finally erupted, it was too late to restore symbolic order. Violence without legitimacy does not unify. It fractures. The people fought fiercely, but without the invisible glue that once bound city, army, and belief into a single organism. The empire could still kill, but it could no longer command. This hidden turn is often misrepresented as naivety or superstition. That interpretation is convenient, but false. The decision was rational within the framework that had governed imperial success for decades. That is precisely why it failed. The framework itself had become obsolete, and no one recognized it in time. History does not punish ignorance as harshly as it punishes outdated certainty. The decision to preserve control through restraint was meant to avoid catastrophe. Instead, it delayed confrontation until authority itself became the casualty. By the time force was unleashed, it no longer served preservation. It served vengeance. And vengeance cannot rebuild legitimacy. The empire did not fall because it welcomed strangers. It fell because it mistook symbolic authority for invulnerability, and learned, too late, that symbols only protect those who control how they are perceived. The consequences arrived not as resolution, but as acceleration. Once restraint collapsed, events moved faster than anyone could control them. The city that had been frozen by uncertainty ignited with directionless rage, and rage does not calculate outcomes, it seeks release. What followed was not the clean expulsion of invaders, but a chain reaction that stripped the empire of the very advantages it still possessed. The night of the escape was chaotic, brutal, and deceptively hopeful. Under rain and darkness, the foreigners attempted to flee along the narrow causeways, weighed down by stolen wealth that glimmered uselessly in the dark. Warriors poured from canoes, striking from angles impossible to defend against. Bridges collapsed. Men slipped, drowned, were dragged beneath the water by armor that had once made them feel invincible. Hundreds died before dawn. The lake swallowed bodies, weapons, and gold alike. For the people watching from the city, it felt like vindication. Proof that the empire could still bleed its enemies. Proof that the humiliation could be erased through force. The invaders were gone. The sacred center was reclaimed. The old order, it seemed, had survived the test. But survival and recovery are not the same thing. What the city did not see that night was what had already escaped with the survivors: knowledge. The invaders left behind dead comrades, but carried with them a precise understanding of how the empire fractured under pressure. They knew the choke points. They knew the politics. They knew which allies would defect and which grudges could be weaponized. Most importantly, they knew the ruler could be neutralized, and that doing so paralyzed the entire system. The empire, meanwhile, was exhausted. The uprising had been spontaneous, not strategic. Food reserves were strained. Trade routes disrupted. Leadership contested. The symbolic center, the ruler, was gone, not as a unifying martyr, but as a figure whose final moments were clouded by ambiguity and resentment. There was no singular voice left to command unquestioned loyalty. Succession became urgent, political, and divisive. Then came the invisible enemy. Disease moved faster than armies ever could. It arrived without warning, without negotiation, without respect for hierarchy or ritual. Smallpox tore through the population with mathematical cruelty. Those who had never encountered it had no immunity. Entire households fell silent in days. Warriors weakened. Priests died mid-ritual. Leaders succumbed before consolidating power. The numbers were devastating. In some regions, a third of the population died within months. In others, more than half. This was not merely loss of life, it was loss of continuity. Knowledge holders vanished. Commanders disappeared. Labor collapsed. The city that had once functioned like a machine now struggled to bury its dead. And while the empire fought the disease blindly, the invaders prepared. They returned not as guests, but as engineers of siege. They brought reinforcements, indigenous allies in overwhelming numbers, and ships designed to dominate the lake that had once protected the city. Causeways were cut systematically. Food was starved. Water poisoned. What had once been a capital of ritual order became an enclosed battlefield where hunger did more damage than weapons. The difference this time was legitimacy. The new leadership fought bravely. The warriors resisted with discipline and ferocity. But the population no longer believed survival was guaranteed by tradition alone. Fear had replaced cosmic certainty. Allies who once hesitated now defected openly. The empire was no longer an inevitability, it was a contender. Siege compresses time. Days blur. Decisions become irreversible faster. As starvation set in, rituals lost meaning. Symbols no longer comforted. People did not question the gods, they questioned whether the gods were still listening. And once belief fractures, endurance follows. The final fall was not dramatic in the way legends prefer. It was attritional. Street by street. House by house. A city collapsing inward as systems failed simultaneously. The lake filled with debris. Temples were stripped. The capital that had once orchestrated power across a continent became a cautionary silence. What ended the empire was not superior numbers, weapons, or cruelty alone. It was momentum created by a single earlier decision that allowed the enemy to understand how to dismantle authority without destroying infrastructure. The capture of the ruler had revealed the skeleton of power. Everything afterward was execution. By the time the city fell, the outcome no longer surprised anyone who understood what had been lost in that first quiet moment of restraint. The empire had fought valiantly, but without the psychological coherence that once multiplied its strength. This is the cruel paradox of power: once its illusion is broken, raw force must compensate. And raw force is never enough against time, disease, and learned enemies. The decision meant to preserve order had delayed conflict just long enough for the empire to face it without unity, without immunity, and without the authority that once made obedience instinctive. And that is how the end arrived, not overnight in spectacle, but overnight in inevitability. The aftermath did not feel like an ending to those who lived through it. It felt like disorientation. The world did not collapse in a single moment of silence or fire. It continued, altered, inverted, and stripped of familiarity. Streets still existed, but they led somewhere else. Temples still stood, but their meaning had been hollowed out. Authority still spoke, but in a language that no longer belonged to the land. The fall of Aztec Empire did not simply remove a ruling class. It dismantled an entire psychological framework that had governed life, death, and purpose. Tribute systems were repurposed. Ritual calendars were disrupted. Education, once centered on preparing citizens for cosmic duty and martial discipline, was replaced with structures designed for extraction and compliance. Power no longer flowed upward through belief, it flowed outward through enforcement. What emerged was not immediate stability, but a long, grinding transformation. The capital was rebuilt physically, stone by stone, atop its own ruins. Canals were filled. Causeways widened. The lake that had once protected the city was drained and controlled. This was not merely engineering, it was symbolic erasure. The geography of power was redesigned to prevent the old logic from ever reasserting itself. Where central authority had once been sacred, it was now administrative. Where obedience had once been ritualized, it was now regulated. For the survivors, adaptation was not optional. Former elites negotiated survival by collaboration. Some preserved fragments of their status by serving the new order as intermediaries. Others vanished into obscurity. Warriors became laborers. Priests became targets. Knowledge systems that had taken centuries to refine were dismissed as superstition, not because they lacked complexity, but because they legitimized a world that no longer existed. Disease continued its work long after conquest ended. Generations grew up without elders to teach them continuity. Oral histories fractured. Lineages dissolved. This demographic collapse reshaped everything: land ownership, family structure, labor, memory. The population decline was so severe that entire regions were left underpopulated, altering settlement patterns for centuries. And yet, resistance did not vanish. It changed form. Rebellions flared and failed. Cultural practices went underground. Symbols survived in fragments, disguised within new rituals, embedded into art, language, and custom. The conquerors controlled territory, but never fully controlled meaning. Beneath compliance, identity persisted, muted, adaptive, and patient. The larger historical shift extended far beyond one city or one empire. This moment marked a turning point in how power would operate across continents. It demonstrated that centralized authority, no matter how vast, could be neutralized through psychological disruption rather than total annihilation. That belief systems could be weaponized. That legitimacy was as decisive as force. Empires elsewhere took note, consciously or not. Colonial strategies evolved around these lessons. Control the symbolic center. Divide legitimacy. Replace ritual authority with administrative routine. Prevent proximity from becoming vulnerability by ensuring hierarchy flowed one way only. These patterns repeated across the globe, from the Americas to Africa to Asia, shaping centuries of domination. But the most enduring consequence was internal. The people who inherited this transformed world no longer trusted inevitability. The idea that power was guaranteed by tradition died with the old order. In its place emerged a harsher realism: survival required adaptation, not reverence. Authority had to be negotiated, not assumed. This psychological shift echoed through generations, influencing how communities related to power long after the conquerors themselves faded into history. Ironically, the invaders who benefited from this collapse would eventually face similar dynamics. Overextension. Bureaucratic rigidity. Assumptions of permanence. The same structural confidence that once defined invincibility would, in time, make them vulnerable to forces they failed to interpret correctly. History did not end with the fall. It recycled its logic. What had been lost was not just sovereignty, but the illusion that systems endure because they always have. The empire's downfall became a case study in how quickly legitimacy can evaporate once perception shifts. No amount of infrastructure, military tradition, or cosmic narrative can compensate when authority no longer feels coherent. This is the deeper aftermath rarely acknowledged. Empires do not simply leave ruins behind. They leave lessons embedded in the psychology of the conquered and the conqueror alike. Lessons about proximity and control. About restraint and decisiveness. About how power, once exposed as conditional, must reinvent itself or decay. The city fell. The empire dissolved. But the consequences stretched forward, into legal systems, cultural memory, global trade, and the very idea of what conquest meant. What replaced it was not just a new ruler, but a new grammar of power. And all of it traced back to that first decision that allowed uncertainty to cross the threshold and stand unchallenged at the center of authority. The world that followed was quieter in ritual, louder in enforcement, and far less forgiving of hesitation. The final lesson of this story is not about conquest, or technology, or even betrayal. It is about perception, and the fragile agreement that makes power feel real. Empires do not exist because they are strong. They exist because enough people believe their strength is inevitable. The moment that belief fractures, strength must work harder, louder, and faster to compensate. And it almost never can. The decision that ended this empire overnight was not violent. It was cautious. It was measured. It was made with the intention of preserving stability. And that is precisely why it worked against those who made it. Human systems are often destroyed not by their excesses, but by their virtues applied too late or too rigidly. Patience becomes paralysis. Restraint becomes surrender. Tradition becomes blindness. What failed here was not intelligence, but imagination. The leadership could not imagine a world in which their sacred authority could be treated as leverage rather than law. They could not imagine that someone would see proximity not as submission, but as opportunity. They could not imagine that their most stable assumption, that legitimacy was untouchable, was the very thing an outsider would test first. This is a recurring pattern in history. When systems succeed for long enough, they begin to confuse precedent with permanence. They assume that because something has never happened, it cannot happen. They build defenses against threats they recognize, not against threats that require redefining the rules. And when the rules change quietly, the response arrives loudly, but too late. The most dangerous moment for any institution is not crisis. It is transition disguised as normality. The foreigners did not defeat the empire by force at first. They defeated it by understanding it. By recognizing that power was centralized not only structurally, but symbolically. By realizing that if the symbol could be controlled, the structure would hesitate. And hesitation, in a moment that demands clarity, is fatal. This is uncomfortable to accept, because it removes the comfort of moral distance. It suggests that collapse is not reserved for the corrupt or the cruel. It can happen to the disciplined, the ritualized, the intelligent. It can happen to systems that genuinely believe they are acting responsibly. Especially to those systems. The psychological insight is stark: authority is only absolute when it never needs to prove itself. The moment it explains, negotiates, or restrains itself in the presence of a challenger who does not share its values, it invites reinterpretation. And reinterpretation is the first step toward replacement. This is why the most consequential decisions in history often appear boring in hindsight. No dramatic speech. No battlefield gamble. Just a choice that feels reasonable because it aligns with how things have always been done. A choice that maintains appearances while quietly changing dynamics. People often ask why resistance did not come sooner, or why the warning signs were ignored. The answer is simple and unsettling. Because acknowledging them would have required admitting that the world had changed. And admitting change is psychologically expensive. It threatens identity, status, and meaning. It is easier to believe the old logic will reassert itself than to risk becoming someone who must act without precedent. That instinct is deeply human. We cling to familiar frameworks not because they are perfect, but because they make the future legible. When those frameworks fail, we do not abandon them immediately. We apply them harder. We double down. We assume the problem is execution, not assumption. And by the time we realize the assumptions themselves are obsolete, the cost of changing them has multiplied. The empire's final tragedy was not defeat. It was recognition. Recognition that the rules no longer protected what they were meant to preserve. That the gods, or the systems, or the traditions, had not failed. They had simply been built for a different world. This is why the story endures. Not because it is unique, but because it is repeatable. Every generation builds institutions on the bones of what came before. Every generation believes its structures are more advanced, more rational, more resilient. And every generation eventually encounters a moment where restraint feels wise, precedent feels safe, and adaptation feels dangerous. That is the moment everything is decided. The empire did not fall when its capital burned. It fell when uncertainty was allowed inside under the assumption it could be managed. When proximity was mistaken for control. When legitimacy was treated as invulnerable rather than renewable. Power does not disappear when it is challenged. It disappears when it is misunderstood. And the most unforgiving truth history offers is this: the decisions that feel safest in the moment are often the ones that end everything quietly, efficiently, and without warning. Not because they are wrong, but because the world has already moved on.